So these notes today are going to cover our part three of the Cold War, and we're going to branch off into the Vietnam War and some other conflicts that happened around the planet, again, in the struggle between the Soviet Union and the United States. So the important vocab for today is going to be guerrilla. A guerrilla is a soldier who is not part of a formal army usually. They use guerrilla warfare, hit and run tactics, assassination to try and take down enemies that are more powerful than them. Ho Chi Minh, he's going to be the leader of the Vietnamese communists. He's going to be very important during the Vietnam War. He's pretty much going to lead North Vietnam. The domino theory is the most important one here. It's the one that you have to understand. The domino theory is going to drive American foreign policy during the second half of the Cold War. And the United States believes that just like a row of dominoes, if one nation falls to communism, then the other nations around it will slowly fall to communism as well. Think of if you lined a bunch of dominoes up in a row and you flip one domino, they fall down and it causes the next one to fall down, the next one. That's what they believe it's going to be like with communism. The Viet Cong are just communist rebels in South Vietnam. So they are South Vietnamese communists fighting to try and switch Vietnam to communism. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the changes in the colonies, and this will go along with decolonization, which we'll go over way later. And this is where the colonies after World War II, a lot of them begin to demand independence. The European nations can't support their colonies anymore. They can't afford them. A lot of colonies fought for their European nations during World War II or provided resources, so they want independence. The US supports independence because we were a former colony that got rid of our colonizer, but we also want to stop communism. That's one of our main goals, is stopping the spread of communism. The USSR would then go on to support dictators all over the world in the colonies that were getting independence because they wanted to sway them to their side. And it really didn't matter if you were a dictator as long as you were allied with either the US or the USSR and you could get support from them. That brings us to the domino theory, which I already explained in the vocab. You can see it again here, the idea that one nation after another would become communist. So if you look down here at this political cartoon, you have the Viet Cong, who are those South Vietnamese communists. They're going to turn Vietnam communist, and that's going to turn Laos communist, and Cambodia and Thailand, and it's going to spread all throughout Asia. And the only thing stopping them is the United States defeating communists in those nations. This will lead the United States to involve itself in a bunch of different wars, most importantly, the Vietnam War. And that brings us to the war in Southeast Asia or Vietnam. So Southeast Asia is the area that's usually referred to the area below China, Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia. That whole area is Southeast Asia. So French Indochina was the name of this area when it was colonized by France, and it was the countries of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos all crammed together into a colony. And there's actually two phases of the Vietnam War. There's the fight against the French, where the Vietnamese communists fight against the French to get their independence, and then the fight against the United States, where Vietnam is split into North and South Vietnam, and the North Vietnamese are trying to flip South Vietnam to communism, and the US and South Vietnam are trying to preserve South Vietnam's independence. After World War II, the French want to reestablish control over Indochina. Indochina had been taken from them by Japan, and they had fought against the Japanese together. But after the war, the Vietnamese, the Cambodians, and the people in Laos all wanted their independence. And this guy, Ho Chi Minh, over here, begins to form a communist revolution against the French to get their independence. Originally, he was more of a nationalist, but he eventually turned to communism and the Soviet Union and China for help. Eventually, what happens is in 1954, the French are defeated at a critical battle in history called Dien Bien Phu. A whole French army is surrounded, trapped, and essentially destroyed and captured by Ho Chi Minh's forces, and Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos all get their independence from France. There's an immediate disagreement, though, over is it going to be a capitalist country or is it going to be a communist country? And this will bring the superpowers in. This is just the Battle of Dien Bien Phu here. You can see the French dropping their paratroopers in. They got surrounded by the Vietnamese in these hills. They eventually got besieged and conquered. After Vietnam's independence, the nation was split. And you can see over here we have communist North Vietnam, and I'm just going to put an A, I guess, for anti communist South Vietnam. It really wasn't that much of a democracy, but it was just anti communist. So naturally, China and the Soviet Union are going to support the North, which is communist. The United States is going to support the South, which is anti communist. And they both want to reunite the nation. So everybody wants Vietnam to be one nation. They don't want a North and a South Vietnam like we had in Korea. But the elections to do it never occur because they can't agree on a process. Ho Chi Minh up here in North Vietnam, his goal is any way possible reunite Vietnam under communism. So the United States had been supporting South Vietnam for a while. Originally, we sent over people to train their military and supplies, and our Navy patrolled their waters. But in 1964, all of that changes. So a U.S. ship was patrolling off the coast of South Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin, and it was reportedly attacked by the North Vietnamese Navy. President Johnson at the time then gets from Congress what's called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gives him the ability to stop aggression in South Vietnam from North Vietnam. Notice this is not a declaration of war. This is basically like giving him a free hand to do a police action. That's what they're going to call Vietnam. We're not in a war, we're policing the area to try and stop the communists. So the United States is going to fight all of the Vietnam War without actually declaring war on Vietnam. So our first major battle is between the U.S. and the South Vietnamese government and the Viet Cong. This takes place actually in South Vietnam, and like I said before, the Viet Cong are those South Vietnamese communist rebels. By day, they're just regular farmers, regular fishermen. By night, they blow up, supply lines. They assassinate officials. They attack U.S. bases. They use guerrilla warfare to try and push the U.S. and the South Vietnamese government out and reunite with the communist North Vietnam. The US responds by using what's called search and destroy missions. There's really no goal in the Vietnam War other than kill as many of the Viet Cong as they can. They go out, they try and find the Vietnamese, they're the Viet Cong, they try and find their supplies, they burn it, as you can see in this picture, they kill the Viet Cong in that area, and then they leave. And this makes the Vietnam War very murky. It's difficult to tell who is who because that farmer that may have given you directions during the day now has a rifle at night and is shooting at you. And this causes the Vietnam War to be a very lengthy and very tough war on the American army. You can see the map here, how everything was kind of split up. So you had North Vietnam funneling supplies down through what's called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was their supply line, into South Vietnam so that the Viet Cong could then launch those attacks on the South Vietnamese government and the United States. What this is going to do, though, is it's going to bring Laos and Cambodia into the war because you can see the Ho Chi Minh Trail skirts the border between the two countries, goes through Cambodia and Laos, and then down into South Vietnam. This is because most of this area is jungle and there's not a lot of people who live there, so there's lots of areas for the communists to hide. The other side of the war is the US and South Vietnam versus the actual North Vietnamese army. There's very few conventional battles. So a conventional battle is a battle between actually two armies with tanks and planes and everything like that. And this is because the United States is so overwhelmingly powerful versus North Vietnam, they can't afford to fight a lot of these battles. The United States absolutely destroys their army every time they meet. The exception to this is the Tet Offensive. So this is the all-out Hail Mary North Vietnamese and Viet Cong offensive all over South Vietnam. It's supposed to be like a knockout blow, take out the South Vietnamese government, knock the United States out of the war, reunite Vietnam. The U.S. does win the Tet Offensive, though. The U.S. and South Vietnamese successfully kill most of the Viet Cong. They destroy whole North Vietnamese armies, but the offensive and the battles are broadcast all over the United States to the public through TV. And the public in the U.S. begins to think the war is unwinnable. It's not worth it. Bring the soldiers home. And this starts like the hippie movement, the anti-war movement that really put pressure on the government to end the Vietnam War. At the same time, the United States is using their air power through Operation Rolling Thunder, which is an absolutely huge bombing campaign to try and bomb the Ho Chi Minh Trail to cut the supply lines into South Vietnam that the Viet Cong are using. This is also a failure. And again, the public sees we're just wasting money in Vietnam. We're wasting lives in Vietnam. Bring the troops home. It's not worth it. This is just a video on the Tet Offensive. It kind of explains what it is if you want to watch it. So the Vietnam War really begins to end with the election of Richard Nixon. So Nixon defeats Johnson in the presidential elections, and Nixon immediately sits down with the North Vietnamese and they come up with the Paris Peace Accords. And the Paris Peace Accords are a plan to end the war in Vietnam and hopefully someday reunite Vietnam. And the two major agreements are A, the United States withdraws its troops. All US troops in Vietnam are to leave. And two, North Vietnam agrees not to invade South Vietnam. U.S. withdraws its troops. South Vietnam is basically defenseless. You can kind of guess what happens next. The North invades South Vietnam in 1975. South Vietnam, pretty much their army disintegrates, their government disintegrates, and it's reunited under communism. The U.S. then responds by boycotting the newly formed nation of Vietnam. They get their help from the Soviet Union and China, and it's kind of a tense relationship for years. Kind of along with the Vietnam War, but happening right beside it, Vietnam's neighbor Cambodia was also going through a communist revolution, and the Khmer Rouge, the Red Cambodians, overthrow the government of Cambodia in 1975. They're led by this guy in the upper right-hand corner, Pol Pot, and he is, for lack of a better word, a madman. He wants to purge all of Cambodia of anything Western. He wants to make like this Asian communist society that doesn't have anything Western. That's like people with glasses are even killed. He empties whole cities and sends them out into the fields to work so they can learn to be like real people and real workers. And that is a major problem because A, it collapses a society, and B, most of those people do not know how to grow food. So over 1 million Cambodians are killed because of the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot, and it's actually a genocide in Cambodia. They haven't identified a lot of the victims today even. It's so bad that in 1979, Vietnam invades and ends the genocide, even though Pol Pot is a communist ally. So switching from Asia, we're going to go over to Africa during the Cold War. And Africa is very interesting during the Cold War in that there is confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union, but it's a lot more like a chess game over there and trying to get allies. So Africa is undergoing what's called decolonization at this time, and it's where African nations are slowly gaining independence from the Europeans colonizers. The reasons for this are A, African nationalism. After World War II, they began to have pride in their countries. So there was like Congolese pride, there was Algerian pride, there was Kenyan pride, and they wanted their own countries for their own people. Western educated Africans and soldiers came home to their native countries and began to spread those ideas from Europe about having their own nation. And finally, simply, the Europeans could not afford their colonies. World War II had totally destroyed most of the nations in Europe. Colonies were the last thing on their minds, so they began granting them independence to kind of get rid of them so they didn't have to pay for them. There were some problems facing the new nations of Africa, though. In a lot of these nations, well, in a few of these nations, like South Africa and Rhodesia, that became Zimbabwe and Namibia, there were white settlers who didn't want the Africans to rule over them. They were a very small minority. They controlled all the power, they controlled all the money. So they resisted that independence because they didn't want African rule. Probably the number one and biggest issue in Africa right here is the ethnic and language rivalries. There's a lot of different ethnic groups in Africa. There is no such thing as an African. There are individual ethnic groups just like there are in Europe and Asia, and they form themselves into nations. And a lot of times they live right next to a group that they really don't like. And that's going to cause tensions between and in the new nations themselves. The second biggest issue is the border conflicts. So the nations were drawn with no regard to their borders of where different ethnic groups and languages lived. The Europeans just split them up. If two different groups that hated each other got put in the same colony, it didn't matter. But when they're given independence, those groups are going to fight over who controls the country. This leads to a lot of corrupt governments, the rise of dictators and coups to overthrow elected governments. And again, the colonial powers and foreign companies, they still maintain control of areas. So even though Belgium let go of the Congo and let it become its own nation, they still controlled a lot of the resources that Belgium or that the Congo had. And lastly, the US and the USSR during this time are going to interfere. They want allies in Africa that are on their side. So the United States wants to get capitalist allies, USSR wants to get communist allies, and they're going to interfere with elections. There's going to be coups, there's going to be invasions to try and switch those nations to their side. So the superpowers enter the conflicts in Africa immediately, mostly because Africa is very, very resource rich. There are a lot of resources in Africa that can only be found in those certain areas. And the United States and the Soviet Union both need them. So, for example, in the Congo, there's a resource called cobalt, and cobalt makes missile guidance chips, which are obviously very important to the United States and the Soviet Union in their nuclear arms race. The US and USSR want influence there so they can spread their ideas and get those resources. And this will lead both of them to support rebel groups, dictators, different factions inside countries, political parties, and try and get them to be in power so they have access to the things they need. So this guy up here is Mobutu. He's going to be the dictator of the Congo. He's going to be supported by the United States because he gives the United States the resources we need. This is a communist political party in Angola, even though they were absolutely brutal towards the non communist Angola and killed hundreds of thousands of people. They're supported by the Soviet Union because they give the Soviet Union the resources and influence they need. So the effects of the Cold War in Africa are huge. There's a lot of conflicts that come out of it. There is a lot of national and ethnic tension because the United States, the Soviet Union, Cuba, Europe, they're meddling in the affairs of these nations and supporting different factions. And it'll lead to civil wars in places like Liberia, where once the Cold War ends, there's all these factions fighting for power. It leads to genocides in Rwanda because the Belgians had originally ruled Rwanda, and when they had left two different groups of people, the Hutu and the Tutsi, and they had treated the Tutsi better than the Hutu, so the Hutu took out revenge on the Tutsi and killed millions of them in just a couple months. There's a huge rise in dictators because the superpowers support dictators if you give them what they need. So there's dictators in nations like Guinea, Zaire, that becomes the Congo, and Uganda. And the final thing is extractive economies. So Africa has a problem with what's called an extractive economy. Down here in the bottom, this is a picture of a diamond mine. And you think that having a diamond mine in your country would make your country very wealthy. But those diamond mines a lot of times are owned by people in Europe, in Asia, United States, Soviet Union. So the money doesn't go to the African nation, it gets funneled out to the nations that own the mine. So even though a lot of African nations have all these resources and all these things they need, they're not going to their countries, they're going to the countries outside of Africa. The final place we're going to cover is Latin America. So this is pretty much South America and Central America and the effects of it during the Cold War. And this is very unique in that it's the United States pretty much trying to fend off communism in the area. So Latin America and the Caribbean, so this whole area in this map in blue, was pretty much America's backyard. It was America's sphere of influence. They even referred to the Caribbean as an American lake at one point because we controlled it so much. And the issue was there was extreme income inequality and social issues. You can see from this picture here, this modern picture, you have multi-million-dollar condos probably on this side, and then quite literally a slum separated by a small wall. These extreme income inequalities make it so communism is very well received by the populations in these nations. So, communist Cuba that we went over earlier changes everything in Latin America. The USSR suddenly has like a base with Cuba that it can begin spreading communism to the rest of Latin America and the Caribbean. It begins to inspire communist revolutions. So this guy on this side, Che Guevara, he is a revolutionary who spreads communist ideas and revolutions. He wants all of Latin America to become communist. This causes the United States to become more aggressive in actually attacking and rolling back communism in Latin America. And the US isn't going to do this a lot through invading places, it's going to do it through supporting rebel groups, supporting governments that are pro United States, and wiping out those communist movements. You can see here through this picture, the United States was very, very active in Latin America. These are the different coups and U.S. interventions that took place in Cuba or in Latin America. And you see the United States was very concerned about keeping Latin America from becoming communist. This is like how the Soviet Union is in Eastern Europe, where they don't want any democracies, they don't want any capitalist countries there, and they're going to do everything they can to keep them out. A big change comes with the Central American crisis in the 1970s. All of a sudden in the 1970s, all these communist rebellions break out across Central America. Nicaragua has a communist government, and the United States tries to support a rebel group called the Contras to overthrow them. Guatemala, a CIA actually overthrows the democratically elected government of Guatemala, and it begins a civil war that lasts all the way into the 90s. In Colombia, there was a communist rebellion that lasted all the way up from the 60s till last year. And the United States is going to support the governments and the groups that are fighting these communists, and it's going to kind of continue a lot of these wars for years and years and years. These are more simmering wars a lot. They're not like outright destroying cities wars. Think of it as a lot of terrorism. There's a lot of drug smuggling going on to fund them, and it destabilizes the governments in these areas. So the major effect of the Cold War on South America is dictatorships. The US and the USSR support dictatorships simply because they support their ideas. So in Brazil and Panama, the United States supports dictators that will fight communism. They're not democratic. Some of them aren't even that capitalist, but they'll fight the communists. The USSR does the same thing. They do it in Peru. They fight a dictator, or they support a dictator who supports communism and will fight the capitalists. The civil wars begin to drag into the 90s and the 2000s. Even after the Cold War ends, a lot of the Latin American countries have been so destabilized, they have civil wars, that income inequality that last into the 90s and the 2000s, and it leads to our modern day immigration crisis. A lot of people now coming to the United States are not coming from Mexico, they're actually coming from places like Guatemala, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and they are fleeing the violence and the destabilization that was caused by the wars during the Cold War. So I hope that makes sense of some of the areas running from about, the 50s to the 70s during the Cold War. And if you have any questions, just let me know.